Hi, I'm Abby, I have a lot of records, and this is Vinyl Monday.
Oh, that sounded really bratty!
So welcome back, or welcome if this is your first time here. Vinyl Monday is the who, what, when, where, why, and how do I feel about classic albums in my collection. If deep dives aren't your thing, don't worry. I also do Vinyl Monday in 60 seconds here on my channel, over on my Instagram, as well as TikTok. One quick announcement before we get this episode going. The Dolls podcast will be back this week. Emma and I took a week off as she slowly eases back into working again. I would really love it if you guys joined us on Friday for a wicked fun episode, and if you gave Emma a nice warm welcome back. Our guest appearance on Losing My Opinion will be out this week as well. That's coming on, I think, Wednesday. Emma and I prepared a super fun segment and a great batch of tunes to bamboozle Matt and Thomas with, including a cut from the Zappa verse. Okay, so Dolls Podcast Friday, Losing My Opinion Wednesday, Vinyl Monday now. This week we are celebrating the 55th anniversary of Frank Zappa, Hot Rats. Congrats to those who guessed this one. Remember, if you want to play along, all you gotta do is check out my community tab. That's where I post my hints to what next week's album is gonna be. I make announcements, I host polls. You can find all of that on my channel. And if you make your way over to my website, you'll find the written version of this review, as well as In the Court of the Crimson King. I was torn as to whether I was going to post this one or Siamese Dream as my last greatest hits review before season 4 kicked off. Siamese Dream won, but this was just too good of an excuse not to feature Hot Rats' birthday twin. Alright, into the Zappa-verse we go. Let's take the plastic off. So my copy is a repress. This is the 50th anniversary edition from 2019, and it's on pink vinyl. It's not often that I have colored vinyl on the main stage. B-roll Abby will be showing you that plenty. Now let's talk about this cover art. For a long time, this cover was misattributed to Ed Karaef, but the Hot Rats art was, in fact, photographed by Miss Andy Nathanson, who also shot the GTO's Permanent Damage. Andy and Ed used very similar infrared techniques. I'll be including these covers next to Ed's shots of Captain Beefheart. I myself nearly misattributed Permanent Damage to Ed. I had to make that edit in post. On the Hot Rats cover, we have the late Christine Frka, aka Miss Christine of the GTOs. She was the Zappa's nanny during Hot Rats sessions. Mark Ellen so acutely observes, quote, "Her hair suggests she'd been plugged into the mains." Quote, "A done-to-a-turn solarization of Miss Christine, ascending vampire-like from an overgrown crypt, it illustrated the resurgence of something delightfully unwholesome from the obscure catacomb where it had crept to recuperate. She wears a crochet getup she made herself. We see it a little bit better on the back of Permanent Damage. Christine was a very talented seamstress. I'll show some more of her work here and here. Opening up the gatefold, we have a collage featuring the man of the hour and lyrics to Willie the Pimp. Gatefold dedicated the album to Frank and Gail's baby son Dweezil, as well as Bub and Gil, whoever they are. My copy includes a timely message from the Zappa estate: register to vote. The Hot Rats packaging was designed by Cal Schenkel. He was a favorite of Zappa's, who worked on Lumpy Gravy, We're Only in It for the Money, Uncle Meat, and many others for the Zappa-verse, including Trout Mask Replica. This is a striking cover, instantly recognizable, very pink. From what little extant footage we have of her, we can tell Christine was a beautiful girl. She photographed very well. It's no wonder she was on so many album covers. On Hot Rats, we of course have the Hitchcock of rock, Frank Zappa, playing guitar, some bass, and various percussion. He's backed by Max Bennett on bass, John Guerin, Paul Humphrey, and Ron Selico on drums, and Ian Underwood on piano, woodwinds, brass, and something called an Organist Maximus. If I had to guess, this would be a pipe organ. Topping the bill of special guests is Captain Beefheart, providing vocals for Willie the Pimp. Son of Johnny Otis, Shuggy Otis plays bass on Peaches and Regalia, Sugarcane Harris and Jean-Luc Ponty share violin duties, and Lowell George plays rhythm guitar, maybe? He says he's on here, but I'm not so sure. Hot Rats was produced and arranged by Frank Zappa. Roll transition. Alright, so what is going on in the Zappaverse right now? Naturally, a lot. Following the We're Only In It for the Money debacle, which I am sure I will make a full video on one of these days, he had a nasty falling out with Verve Records. He pictured a different kind of future for music publishing. A future full of freaks. After a false start with this Sandy Hurwitz record, I cannot believe I found, thank you Rough Trade in New York, very cool, Frank plus manager Herbie Cohen went all in on Bizarre Records. Soon enough, Zappa was playing producer for Captain Beefheart's utterly deranged monumopus, Trout Mask Replica, the certifiably insane Wild Man Fisher, and groupie troupe The GTOs and their delightfully odd Permanent Damage. By going all in on this label with no commercial potential, Zappa practically bankrupted himself. His relationships with all of the above acts strained. He abandoned Permanent Damage for a time after he caught Miss Christine and Miss Mercy using the hard stuff. Wild Man Fisher is a saga that I'd have to make a whole separate video on, and Beefheart was just driving Frank up the fucking wall. The Mothers of Invention, also kinda screwed. They had no commercial potential either. Not the worst thing artistically, but if you're trying to, like, live, it's gonna be pretty hard. Just before they broke up, the Mothers were living on a collective $250 a week between them. This was all they made from their royalties. That's 9 guys living on about $28 each, equating to... $250 a week in today's money. Weird serendipity aside, $250 a week was not worth the shit these guys were taking. According to Mother's saxophone player Bunk Gardner, quote, "There was a riot after the show in Berlin. They threw eggs, hard green pears, liters of paint, metal, even a section of the railing ripped from the front. Zappa handed out medals to the band for surviving this particular incident. Naturally, when Jimmy Carl Black complained about living in abject poverty over the phone, Zappa recorded it, then slapped it onto Uncle Meat."
We're starving, man. This fucking band is starving. And we've been starving for 3 years.
Frank was never motivated by financial success. Not unlike Robert Fripp last week, he made moves to actively avoid it. However, Frank kinda needed a hit to prevent his whole life from blowing up. The Mothers toured internationally for 6 months in hopes of scraping some cash together. As soon as they got home, Zappa booked time at TTG Studios in Hollywood. Sessions started not with Hot Rats, but with material from tour. Live stuff from The Ark in Boston and Albert Hall in London. And tracks laid down at a location the Vinyl Monday verse is very familiar with, Criteria Studios in Miami. At the same time, Zappa was getting what would become Burnt Weenie Sandwich in order. There was a lot of contemporaneous shit happening in the Zappaverse. He described his new direction to Melody Maker, quote, "The emphasis is split between the composing, arranging, and playing. I play guitar and Ian Underwood plays all the reeds and all the keyboards on it, including a real pipe organ with a lot of special effects like percussion sounds and tin whistles, which was in the studio. Just 3 days produced the bones of this album." TTG sessions were spent mixing and matching session players with various members of the Mothers, a lot of which you can hear on the Hot Rats sessions. It's interesting to hear this stuff in pieces. Peaches and Regalia in particular took shape shockingly early in the process. other parts are excruciating. For some of these guys, like future Little Feat founder Lowell George, if he's even on this thing, it'd be their last time recording with Zappa. Because between the TTG sessions and overdubs at Sunset Sound in August, Zappa broke up the Mothers for the first time. Was it low morale? Was it because nobody could afford to tour anymore? Was it because of Frank's leadership style? Was it because no one could understand them? Who knows? Whatever it was, it rendered Hot Rats Frank's second solo album. First, if you're like me and you think Frank should actually be playing on the album for it to be considered a solo album. For what it's worth, Voltmaster Joe Travers says Frank always considered Hot Rats his first solo album, so does this ad. Frank denied it was a breakup when speaking to Melody Maker. Quote, "We're just not performing anymore. We're not getting across. And if we'd continued to progress at the rate we've been doing for the last year and a half, we wouldn't have any audience left at all." About the critical response to his new, quote, electronic chamber music direction, the reviews we got were so simplistic, and I don't want to go on having to put up with all that bullshit. Considering all the zany activity which permeated this world, like a bust-up amongst the Magic Band that left Captain Beefheart with broken dentures, Ian Underwood considered Hot Rats sessions, quote, absolutely normal. As far as Zappa standards, at least. You still have a skinny guy with the greatest mustache you've ever seen barking directions while chain-smoking cigarettes and wearing women's shirts, which, now that I think of it, actually sounds pretty normal by 1969 recording standards. Speaking of recording standards, Hot Rats was made on Sunset Sound's brand spanking new 16-track machine. For context, this is the summer of 1969. Tom Dowd is just now getting 8-track cabinets into studios in the States, and that technology wouldn't be fully embraced across the pond until 1970. Sunset's machine was only a prototype. This kind of thing wouldn't be on the market until well into the 70s. It's like giving Sprite to a medieval serf. It's a whole new level of options which Frank used to the fullest extent. In an interview promoting a gig at the Royal Albert Hall, Frank called Hot Rats, quote, surprisingly easy to listen to. Some people have even been known to tap their feet to it. He also talks about the record he arranged for Jean-Luc Ponty, who guests on this record. As for the title, it was apparently inspired by the solo on Archie Shepp's recording of The Shadow of Your Smile. Frank said Archie, quote, played this solo, and it just sounded to me immediately like there was this fucking army of preheated rats screaming out of his saxophone. Whatever you say, Frank. The track listing of Hot Rats goes as follows. Opening up side 1, we have Peaches and Regalia, followed by Willie the Pimp. And closing out side 1 is Son of Mr. Green Jeans. Opening up side 2 is Little Umbrellas, followed by the Gumbo Variations. And closing out the album is It Must Be a Camel. Hot Rats was released on October 10th, 1969, 55 years ago this week. Also released on that day, The Kinks, Arthur or the Decline and Fall, and If I Had a Nickel for every time Ray Davies postponed an album release and accidentally wound up releasing a Kinks album in tandem with a way bigger album, I'd have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it's happened twice, right? Lester Bangs reviewed Hot Rats in Rolling Stone magazine. He really dug it. Quote, if Hot Rats is any indication of where Zappa is headed on his own, we are in for some fiendish rides indeed. He praised Ian Underwood's musicianship, all but naming him MVP alongside Captain Beefheart's, quote, raffish Dadaism. He names the Gumbo Variations as the strongest track thanks to Sugarcane Harris, while also questioning who the hell this guy was. He also said Zappa hit a high by finding balance between more sober moments dance and 50s doo-wop pastiche, blending that middle point with jazz. His skill means his music, quote, sounds a far and purposely ragged cry from the self-indulgence of the current crop of young white John Coltrane's. I love this man. He's not much for Zappa's improvisational skills, they dry out quickly for him, but he ultimately concludes that if you need a gateway into the new fusion thing, this is a good place to start. Christgau naturally dismissed Hot Rats, saying in the Village Voice, quote, do to you, Frank. When I want movie music, I'll listen to Wonderwall. Is he talking about this Wonderwall? If so, extremely rare Christgau dub. Speaking of divisive critics, Anthony Fantano featured Hot Rats on his very first Classics Week back in 2011. This is all very timely, I have to say. He literally just talked about that episode in like that radio call-in show he does. He said, quote,
if you really value a strong personality, unique melody writing, jazz, this may become a classic for you just as it is for me.
As of me posting this video in October 2024, Hot Rats is the only Zappa review on the Needle Drop channel. There's 2 Zappaverse things if you count Trout Mask Replica. I don't know about you, but the fact that Vinyl Monday has 100% more Zappaverse content than Anthony Fantano is so funny to me. Hot Rats was a lopsided commercial hit upon release. It didn't quite catch in the States, just breaking the Billboard 200 chart at number 173, but as previous Mother's releases had done, Hot Rats did way better across the pond. It peaked at number 9 in the UK the week of April 18th, 1970. It occupied the top 10 with some unlikely neighbors. Bridge Over Troubled Water, the Easy Riders soundtrack, Led Zeppelin 2, Abbey Road, Chicago self-titled, some Motown compilation, a soundtrack, and another album I've never heard of, and Andy Williams. To this day, Hot Rats is the only Zappa studio album to chart this high over there upon release. To celebrate, Zappa took the show on the road, armed with a new band, including Ian Underwood, George Duke, and Flo and Eddie, aka Mark Volman and Howard Kalin of the Turtles. He went on a, quote, 97-date world tour, unclear if he had to hire a Susie Cream Cheese because people still thought she was real. He also swung out to the Actuel Pop and Jazz Festival in Belgium. About the experience, he said, quote, I guess it was more of a political than a musical success. It was so disorganized that when all the lights and amplifications worked on the first night, the organizers looked at each other in amazement. They couldn't believe it was really gonna happen. Of all the acts that played, the Nice were his favorite. He lobbed out Burnt Weenie Sandwich and Chunga's Revenge too, and made sequel albums to Hot Rats, including Waka Jawaka and Sleep Dirt. As for Hot Rats' cover girl, after Zappa fired her for using the hard stuff, he was very no-nonsense about drugs, she left California. She rolled with Todd Rundgren and Russell Mael before finding herself in Cohasset, Massachusetts with Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers. In 1972, she graduated from nursing school. She wanted to become a nurse, but sadly that dream was never a reality for her. She passed just weeks before her 23rd birthday. Today, she's most known for her appearances on the Hot Rats and Runt album covers. In his book, ex-boyfriend Alice Cooper says, quote, I still look at that album cover, meaning this one. It's nice that she's immortalized. Shuggy Otis, who played bass on Peaches and Regalia, grew up and married another GTO, Miss Mercy. They had a son together, Lucky Otis, who makes a 3rd generation of Otis music men. As for the Zappa kiddos, Dweezil has played this whole thing live with his group. I believe he's doing the same thing right now for the 50th anniversaries of Apostrophe and Roxy and Elsewhere. Still kicking myself for missing that show when it came through. And Ahmet says, quote, this is the stuff I was drinking my milk bottles to. It's magical. In 2019, the Hot Rats sessions were released to celebrate the 50th anniversary of this bad boy, featuring liner notes written by The Simpsons creator Matt Groening. He also wrote a blurb for the Hot Rats songbook. His personal copy of the album became the cover photo. And last year, the Funky Nothingness compilation put out 3 hours of material intended for a Hot Rats sequel. So, what do I think of Hot Rats? When venturing into the Zappaverse, you need the album, right? Everyone's the album is gonna be different. If you're a new Alice Cooper fan going on your first deep dive, the album might be Pretty's for You or Love It to Death. If you were a hopeless music nerd in 1969 and your other hopeless music nerd friend referenced
Neon meat dreams of an octopus.
and you didn't know what the hell it was from, then you might fall into the clutches of Trout Mask Replica, you poor soul. If you're a 60s pop culture aficionado and you meme on it just as much as you love it, the album might be We're Only in It for the Money, or Freak Out. If you've just finished reading Pamela Des Barres' book, the album might be Permanent Damage. For most appropriately geeky but otherwise well-adjusted people, Hot Rats is the album. It was for Matt Groening. Here's how he remembers Hot Rats wandering into his life. Quote, "It was an unforgettable day in October 1969 when the album first showed up at the Long Hair Music Faucet, my local psychedelic record dungeon in Portland, Oregon. Frugally augmenting my $2 weekly allowance with my loose change lunch money, I forked over the cash to the blissed out hippie behind the counter who warned, I don't know, man, it's kind of jazzy. So there I was, flopped on the floor in my sick little teenage bedroom. I dropped the needle and settled back for the, quote, movie for your ears, as Frank promised on the inside gatefold cover. From the opening moments of that unforgettable drum fill, I was transported. Mini masterpiece, Peaches and Regalia, elevated my scrawny body into the air, spun me around like a propeller beanie, and melted my brain. Later on, I learned Shuggy Otis played bass on Peaches when he was 15 years old. All I remember accomplishing when I was 15 was lying on my rug, listening to Hot Rats. Why is Hot Rats most people's the album? An answer in many parts. Number one, it's got a balanced, enjoyable atmosphere. It's restrained, but still has that zany, goofy energy. It's silly, but not too silly with the toilet humor and all. It sounds just clean enough to appeal to, but just strange enough to spark interest. Number two, it's technically impressive to both the average listener and the musician. On the surface, it's a great sounding record. It was produced very nicely. Number three, get beneath the surface, and these arrangements are just bonkers. This stuff was executed by a very talented bunch of guys, one of whom was a literal high schooler. There are just two slight drawbacks I can think of, like the relative lack of vocals. It diminishes a crucial element of the Zappa experience, the humor. Frank always said he didn't really care about his lyrics. I disagree. You can tell he had a blast with the double entendres, occasional toilet humor, and goofy delivery. Who was strictly from commercial. We don't get that on Hot Rats. The only vocals we hear on the whole thing are Willie the Pimp, and that's not Frank. And if you're looking for concise, to-the-point songs, the majority of Hot Rats is not it. The majority of the runtime is populated by drawn-out stuff jamming on a central motif with solos. Though Frank was laser-focused on the music is not laser-focused. You may need to pack your patience. Immediately, we listeners are presented with a new dish from the Zappaverse menu. We have a whole buffet of ingredients to choose from. Tremolo guitars recorded at half speed, bass, piano, pipe organ, and the iconic drums which tumble into Peaches. As stated by Joe Travers, quote, Frank said Peaches is a song nobody dislikes. I don't disagree. This is the Zappa song off the Zappa album, and it is for a reason. This song is just delightful. That tremolo and alarm clock sound, who knows what it really is, are some of my favorite textures across Zappa's whole discography. The tremolo is like a little metal ball rolling around an electronic chamber, zapped by staccato notes. No one wrote a melody quite like this man, and we have 3 quintessential Zappa melodies packed into one song. Peaches' 3 movements transition into each other seamlessly, and each suit their core instrument to a T. I believe Frank didn't so much write for music as he wrote for his players. He loved writing stuff that was fun to play, if very difficult. Dweezil is laser focused on the Peaches guitar part in Apostrophe's VH1 Classic Albums special. I'm partial to the second movement. It's one of the most late 70s things the late 60s ever did. The flute might read as dated now, it's very late 70s pop radio, but you have to remember, this was 1969, paired with the funky bass, it's not stale. Each time we return to a motif, there's a new element layered in. The massive pipe organ makes the otherwise whimsical chorus more imposing. Yes, whimsical is the perfect word for Peaches. It shows we can ditch the pastiche, but we won't lose any of the fun. And shout out to Shuggy for holding his own amongst these guys. That is a big feat for any musician, let alone a teenager. After our little peachy parade, Willie the Pimp comes sauntering in. Vocal duties are covered by the inimitable Captain Beefheart in his signature hoarse, phlegmy style. He horks, barks, spits, and splats his way through the song.
Hot rats, hot cats, hot spits.
With him on board, this album isn't entirely without Zappa's cartoony shtick. Frank had a knack for writing arrangements for unconventional instruments as far as rock and roll goes. See the vibraphone, one of his favorite instruments to write for. Having literally just covered Wet and Era King Crimson and referenced 70s Jefferson Airplane over there, this song feels like an important precursor to violin as a rock instrument. I'm not surprised I responded to Willie. It's instruments I'm familiar with, played in ways I'm familiar with, wah-wah and all. Gail said this song was Frank's coming out as a guitar god. We hear the baby steps to the virtuosity to come. That being said, where his comfort zone as a composer was non-existent, Frank falls into a comfort zone fast as a soloist. When he can break out of it, this song rips. I like Willie when it allows itself to be appropriately swampy and smarmy. This song is about a pimp after all. When Frank played himself into a rut, I rotated my focus to other instruments. Ian's sometimes distressed saloon piano, Max Bennett's funky bass, John Guerin riding high on sturdy drums. The breakdown before returning to the violin motif is the most exciting part after Beefheart's turn. Rounding out the first side is Son of Mr. Green Jeans. Yes, there is a Green Jeans Senior.
Eat your greens.
Green Jeans is the exact midpoint between Peaches and Willie. It's got the same classical sensibility and fun feeling as Peaches, but with some prominent, really great guitar work. I have to say, I prefer this solo to Willie's. We have a lot of the same instruments as Peaches, played in similar stylings, bells and all, with slightly more emphasis on the woodwinds this time. Again, if a little long, Frank feels so much freer here, free to coast on Max's refined but no less stylish bass. Paul Humphrey really shocks this thing to life in the last third with dizzying, precise drumming. The melodramatic flourish at the end has a little grit to it, making for a striking closer of the first side. This stuff is no joke. The humor isn't all gone though. Little Umbrellas is rooted in the stereotypical funeral motif. In Moon Unit's recent essay for Newsweek, she expresses her love of her father's gallows humor. This is very literal gallows humor. The funeral march is played in a loose, kitschy, Arabian motif kind of way. The delivery reads like a bobblehead sphinx you'd get after riding camels on a vacation in Egypt, and oh my god, I just made a critical realization. The tone of Hot Rats is the musical equivalent of playing Knick-Knack at the MoMA. You know, the short Pixar had to edit because the Miami pool ladies' knockers were too big. We used to be a proper country. It's irreverent, silly, and self-effacing like that. Zappa wrote humor without dialogue. He wrote the joke in a series of notes on the page. And he chose a group of guys that would deliver the punchline exactly how he wanted. Man, I love music. It's what set this album apart from other jazz, fusion, whatever that term even means, records of the decade to come. See Bitches Brew and The Intermounting Flame. These albums take themselves very seriously. Zappa never does. Even without lyrics, it pokes fun at itself. In that sense, Hot Rats is frighteningly self-aware for bleary-eyed 1969. Other than the haha funnies, Umbrellas is slick, relatively light jazzy fare with a fun swagger thanks to the rhythm section. The off-kilter harmonics between woodwinds are both goofy and cursed. Side 2 kicks into gear with Gumbo variations. Sadly, I only have the 12-minute version of Gumbo. My best friend got the 16-minute version on his somehow. The long version is positively groovy. All around, Gumbo's main attraction and an undeniable MVP of Hot Rats is Ian Underwood. He tackled all the keys and woodwinds, including the saxophone. It's equal parts goofy and greasy with its wanton slip and slides up and down and hilarious squeaks. I can only wonder how Frank went about directing this in the studio. The chemistry between Ian, Paul, and Max is fantastic. Saxophone, bass, and drums. Now that's venturing into jazz territory. Then you have Sugarcane leaning into the foray before tearing up. It was recorded a little thin, it sounds hollow to me, but absolutely no one playing on Gumbo half-assed it. By the time he's wailing around it, some tasteful rhythm guitar slips in to ground things. Tunes like Gumbo are where Frank's talents as a producer shine. He can swap every combination of instruments out, arranging the mantle so it doesn't feel cluttered. Correction, it only feels cluttered when he wants it to. See the ending. The cluttered Zappa chaos I've been craving. We finish things off with the tune most indebted to the jazz half of jazz fusion. On Top 40 radio in Saudi Arabia, it must be a camel. It starts in almost a Vince Guaraldi trio kind of way. If those cartoon ad Zappa commissioned for his records were made into a holiday special, Camel would be the opening theme. Frenetic drum fills soon kill the mood. Camel is full of sour-sounding notes and awkward rhythms. Equal parts incense and dung. The violin honks like a horn, the snare drum batters away, amorphous percussion ventures into that Varese territory Frank so loved. There's some funky textures ping-ponged back and forth between piano and I think vibraphone. Then Frank cuts in these angular, sculptural shapes with his solo. Some fans online say that Camel isn't a great closer, considering the pure power of stuff like Green Jeans and Gumbo. I disagree. This song is quite strange to experience for the first time, and it is subdued in comparison, but it's a natural progression from what came before. In the words of Matt Groening, quote, 1969. What an amazing, confounding, delightful, f***ed up year. It was a pretty explosive 365 days for adventurous music. Leaving aside the pop hits that still dominate our elevators to this day, look at what we got. Miles Davis's In a Silent Way, Moondog's Moondog, Yusef Lateef's Detroit, Emil Richards and the Microtonal Blues Band, Spirit of 1976, Luciano Berrio's Sinfonia, Don Cherry's Eternal Rhythm, Gary Harry Burton's Throb, the Wolfgang Donier Quartet's The Oimels, Fred von Hove's Requiem for Che Guevara, and one of Frank's favorites, Philosophy of the World. And then there's the nicotine and caffeine-fueled, voluptuously busy, and prolific Frank. Joe Travers continues, quote, "There was so much activity swirling around his stratosphere. Touring, recording, producing An Evening with Wildman Fisher, Captain Beefheart's Trout Mask Replica, and the GTO's Permanent Damage, creating Burnt Weenie Sandwich, the album and the movie, and of course, Hot Rats. That's why Hot Rats is special. Not only could it have only happened 55 years ago, it could have only happened from Frank Zappa 55 years ago. It's an event within an event, a microcosm within a microcosm. This is a lot less goofy than our past excursions into the Zappaverse. It's not rooted in parody. If you can't stomach yellow snow jokes, this might be the album for you. Our focus is on composition, music over content. If you're dipping your toe into the jazz musicians that inspired the Cats in the 60s, John Coltrane, Albert Ayler, Archie Shepp, and his army of fucking preheated rats, this might be the album for you as well. If you're venturing into early jazz fusion, Soft Machine, Mahavishnu Orchestra, Miles Davis, this is a no-brainer. Some of the figures listed above are such time capsule artists. They could have only happened in the 1960s and 70s. Forward-thinking as he was, Frank Zappa could have only happened in the 60s. But 55 years later, the rats are still hot, by virtue of this being packaged, produced, and performed so damn well. If you want equal parts gritty and gleaming, whimsical and witty, smart but not pretentious, jazzy, funky, and wacky, with an elbow jab here and a head bob there, Hot Rats is the Zappa album for you. My personal favorites are, once again, the whole thing. If you want to keep up with all of my favorites from all of the Vinyl Mondays, I have a Spotify playlist linked in my description. I update it every week. And that's it! That's maybe the biggest my hair has ever been on camera. That is Hot Rats. What do you think of this album? What do you think of Frank Zappa? Leave a comment letting me know. I love hearing what you guys have to say about albums I love. And remember, despite what some guy on the internet has to say, your opinion matters. And your bratty behavior is welcome. If you like what I do here, you should like this video and subscribe to my channel. I post new episodes of Vinyl Monday every Monday morning at 11 and a new episode of the Dolls podcast every other Friday. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next week. Bye!